Good evening, dear listener. Tonight we venture far from the familiar cobblestones of Victorian London, beyond the gaslit streets and drawing rooms we so often explore together. Instead, we travel across continents and centuries to the golden halls of Tang Dynasty China, where silk whispers against marble floors and incense drifts through corridors of power. Whether you're settling into bed with a warm cup of tea, or perhaps listening as dawn breaks wherever you are in the world, I'm grateful you've chosen to spend these quiet moments with me. Tonight's story begins in shadows, as so many of the most extraordinary tales do. It unfolds in the hidden chambers of the imperial palace, where a young woman named Wu Zhao first learned that survival itself could be an art form, and that sometimes the most profound revolutions begin not with armies or declarations but with a single person refusing to disappear. I wonder, dear listener, if you've ever felt the weight of invisible chains, those unspoken expectations that society drapes across our shoulders before we're even old enough to understand their burden. Tonight we meet someone who not only recognized those chains but learned to transform them into instruments of her own making. This is the story of Wu Zetian, the only woman in China's long history to claim the title of emperor, not empress, mind you, but emperor. A distinction that would echo through 13 centuries of Chinese civilization. But before we speak of thrones and power, let us begin where all human stories must, with a child who dreamed beyond the boundaries of her world. In the early years of the 7th century, when the Tang dynasty was still finding its footing and the Silk Road hummed with merchants and scholars, a daughter was born into the Wu family in Wenshui County. The exact year of her birth remains lost to time, perhaps 624, perhaps 625. But this uncertainty seems fitting for someone who would spend her life rewriting the very notion of what was possible. Her father, Wu Zhihuo, was a man who understood the delicate dance between commerce and politics. He had built his wealth in timber, a practical trade that connected him to both the earth and the instruments of power. Wood for ships, for buildings, for the very scaffolding of empire. When the Tang dynasty rose to power, Wu Zhihuo aligned himself carefully with the new order, his pragmatism rewarded with positions of increasing responsibility. But it was young Wu Zhao who possessed the sharpest mind in the household. While her brothers studied the classics as befitted their station, she lingered at doorways, absorbing conversations about trade routes and political alliances. Her mother, Lady Yang, noticed how the girl's eyes would narrow in concentration when the men discussed matters of state, how she would later be found in the family's modest library, teaching herself to read the texts that were meant only for male eyes. Picture, if you will, a girl of perhaps 10 or 11, small hands tracing characters by candlelight, her young mind already beginning to question why certain knowledge was forbidden to her simply by virtue of her sex. In those quiet hours, as the household slept and the oil lamp flickered, something took root in Wu Zhao that would prove impossible to extinguish: the radical notion that intelligence belonged to whoever possessed it, regardless of the body that housed it. When Wu Zhihuo died suddenly in 635, the family's carefully constructed world began to fracture. Wu Zhao was barely 11, old enough to understand that her father's death meant more than grief. It meant vulnerability. In Tang Dynasty China, a family's protection often died with its patriarch, and widows and daughters became burdens to be managed rather than people to be cherished. Her half-brothers, products of her father's first marriage, made their intentions clear with casual cruelty. The family's wealth would be theirs to control, the family's future theirs to determine. Wu Zhao and her mother found themselves relegated to the margins of their own household, their opinions unwelcome, their needs secondary. It was a harsh lesson in powerlessness, but one that would prove formative. The girl who had once freely roamed her father's library now learned what it meant to be truly confined. Yet confinement, paradoxically, can sometimes sharpen the very qualities it seeks to suppress. In those years of diminished circumstances, Wu Zhao's mind grew more acute, her observations more penetrating. She watched how power flowed through relationships, how alliances shifted like sand, how those who appeared weak could sometimes wield influence through invisible channels. She was receiving an education that no formal schooling could provide, the deep, often brutal curriculum of survival. In 636, when Wu Zhao had just turned 12, whispers began to circulate through the capital about the emperor's search for new concubine. Emperor Taizong, the second ruler of the Tang dynasty, was known for his military brilliance and administrative reforms, but he was also a man who understood that an emperor's private life was inseparable from his public image. The imperial harem was not merely a collection of beautiful women. It was a carefully orchestrated symbol of the empire's prosperity and the emperor's virility. The selection process was elaborate, almost ritualistic in its precision. Young women from noble families across the empire were evaluated not only for their physical beauty but for their accomplishments in poetry, music, and the subtle arts of conversation. It was an honor. The families were told to contribute a daughter to the emperor's household, but Wu Zhao, with her precocious understanding of power dynamics, likely recognized it for what it truly was, a transaction in which women were the currency. When the imperial messengers arrived at the Wu family compound, Wu Zhao was selected as a Karen, one of the lower-ranking concubines in the complex hierarchy of the imperial harem. She was perhaps 13 years old, still a child by our standards, yet old enough, by the conventions of her time, to understand the magnitude of this transition. She would leave behind the familiar rhythms of her family home for the glittering, dangerous world of the Forbidden City. The journey to Chang'an, the Tang capital and one of the largest cities in the world at that time, must have been both exhilarating and terrifying for a girl who had never traveled far from her birthplace. Chang'an was a cosmopolitan marvel, home to over 1 million people, its markets filled with goods from across the known world. Persian carpets lay beside Indian spices, Buddhist monks walked alongside Zoroastrian priests, and the air itself seemed to shimmer with possibility and peril. But the imperial palace was its own universe, governed by rules and rituals that had evolved over centuries. The harem quarters were luxurious beyond imagination, silk hangings in every shade, gardens where fountains played eternal music, courtyards where peacocks strutted among carefully tended orchids. Yet for all its beauty, it was unmistakably a prison. The women who lived there were surrounded by luxury but deprived of agency, their lives circumscribed by protocols they had no role in creating. Wu Zhao entered this world with the title Wu Mei, meaning beautiful, a name that reduced her to her physical appearance and nothing more. But if the court expected her to fade into the background like so many other young concubines, they had gravely underestimated their new arrival. Emperor Taizong, despite his reputation for wisdom and justice in matters of state, seems to have initially overlooked Wu Zhao entirely. She was young, relatively low-ranking, and came from a family that, while respectable, lacked the kind of ancient bloodlines that typically commanded imperial attention. But Wu Zhao understood something that many of her fellow concubines did not. In a world where women were often seen as interchangeable ornaments, the woman who could make herself truly indispensable would find a very different kind of power. She began by distinguishing herself through learning. While other concubines focused on perfecting their musical skills or their poetry, Wu Zhao devoured everything she could find about statecraft, history, and political philosophy. She made herself useful to the emperor not just as a beautiful young woman, but as someone capable of intelligent conversation about the very issues that consumed his days. In the evenings, when Taizong sought relaxation from the burdens of empire, he increasingly found himself drawn to the thoughtful observations of the young woman who seemed to understand the complexities of governance with startling intuition. But palace life taught Wu Zhao other lessons as well, darker ones about the precarious nature of imperial favor. She watched as concubines who fell out of favor simply vanished from court life, their names struck from records as if they had never existed. She observed the careful choreography required to navigate the jealousies and alliances that governed the harem's social structure. Most importantly, she learned that in a world where women had no official power, survival depended on understanding the unofficial channels through which influence actually flowed. As the months turned into years, Wu Zhao's position in the palace evolved in ways that surprised even her. Emperor Taizong, initially drawn to her intelligence, began to rely on her insights with increasing frequency. She possessed an unusual ability to synthesize complex information and present it in ways that clarified rather than complicated the issues at hand. More remarkably, she seemed to understand the human psychology underlying political decisions, the fears, ambitions, and resentments that drove ministers and generals and foreign ambassadors. By her late teens, Wu Zhao had become something unprecedented in the Tang court, a concubine who was also a confidant, a beautiful woman who was valued as much for her mind as for her appearance. She attended meetings that would have been unthinkable for other women to join, offering opinions that the emperor not only welcomed but actively sought. Yet this very success created new danger. The more indispensable she became to Taizong, the more she threatened the established order of court life. Senior ministers watched with growing unease as a young woman, and a relatively low-born one at that, gained influence that some of them lacked. Fellow concubines observed her rise with mixtures of admiration and alarm, recognizing that Wu Zhao was playing by rules that none of them fully understood. Perhaps most significantly, Wu Zhao caught the attention of Crown Prince Lai Jai, Taizong's son and heir. Lai Jai was a young man of scholarly temperament, more comfortable with books than with the military campaigns that had defined his father's reign. He possessed a gentleness that set him apart from the warrior tradition of his family, but also perhaps a weakness that would prove both blessing and curse. The attraction between Wu Zhao and Lai Jai was immediate and mutual, but it was also deeply dangerous. In the rigid hierarchy of the imperial court, the relationship between a father's concubine and his son was not merely inappropriate, it was potentially treasonous. Yet the two young people found ways to meet, to exchange poetry, to engage in the kind of intellectual and emotional intimacy that Wu Zhao had never experienced, and that Lai Jai had never dared hope for. Their relationship remained secret, carried on through glances across crowded halls, through carefully coded messages, through brief encounters in gardens where the sound of fountains might mask whispered conversation. It was a romance that existed entirely in shadows, sustained by the very danger that made it impossible to pursue openly. When Emperor Taizong died in 6049, Wu Zhao faced the greatest crisis of her young life. By tradition, concubines who had not borne the deceased emperor children were expected to retire to Buddhist convents, effectively disappearing from the world to spend their remaining years in prayer and contemplation. For most women in Wu Zhao's position, this represented the end of any meaningful existence, a kind of living death that allowed the new emperor to start his reign with a clean slate. Wu Zhao found herself standing at the entrance to Gangyi Temple, her head shaved according to Buddhist custom, wearing the simple gray robes of a nun. At 24, she was being asked to accept that her life was effectively over, that the intelligence and ambition that had brought her so far would now be buried beneath layers of ritual and resignation. For many women, the convent represented a kind of peace, after the dangerous game of palace politics. For Wu Zhao, it felt like suffocation.
But even in the convent, she remained in Li Ji's thoughts. Now Emperor Gaozong, he found himself struggling with the immense responsibilities of rule while longing for the companion who had understood both his dreams and his fears. Palace life, for all its luxury and ceremony, felt hollow without someone with whom he could share his authentic thoughts rather than the carefully calibrated words required of an emperor. The story of how Wu Zhao returned to the palace has been told and retold countless times, each version shaped by the teller's perspective on power, love, and propriety. What seems certain is that Emperor Gaozong's longing for her companionship eventually overcame the considerable obstacles that stood in their way. In 6050, on the anniversary of Taozong's death, Gaozong visited Ganyai Temple to pay his respects. Whether this meeting was carefully orchestrated or represented a moment of spontaneous decision remains unclear, but its consequences were immediate and profound. When Gaozong saw Wu Zhao in her nun's robes, both of them were overwhelmed by emotions that imperial protocol could not contain. Within months, arrangements were quietly made for her return to the palace, officially as a servant, but in reality as the new emperor's most trusted advisor. Wu Zhao's return to court represented a shocking violation of established custom. The whispers began immediately. How could the emperor recall a woman who had been his father's concubine? What did this say about his respect for tradition, for the sacred bonds between father and son? Senior ministers worried that this precedent might encourage other departures from established protocol, while members of the imperial family questioned whether Gaozong possessed the strength of character necessary to rule effectively. But if Wu Zhao felt the weight of disapproval, she showed no signs of wavering. Instead, she seemed to understand that her unprecedented return to power meant that conventional approaches would no longer serve her. She would have to invent new methods of wielding influence, new ways of transforming criticism into opportunity. She began by making herself indispensable to Gaozong in ways that went beyond their personal relationship. The young emperor was struggling with the complexities of governance, overwhelmed by the competing demands of military commanders, senior ministers, and regional governors. Wu Zhao possessed both the intellectual capacity to understand these challenges and the emotional intelligence to help Gaozong navigate the human dimensions of leadership. More than this, she demonstrated an ability to make difficult decisions that Gaozong found personally painful. When situations arose that required harsh measures, the dismissal of popular but ineffective officials, the resolution of complex disputes between powerful families, Wu Zhao proved willing to bear the burden of unpopularity in order to advance what she saw as the empire's interests. By 6055, Wu Zhao had been formally elevated to the position of consort, ranking second only to Empress Wang in the palace hierarchy. But titles she had learned mattered less than actual influence, and her actual influence now extended far beyond what any consort in Chinese history had ever wielded. The story of Wu Zhao's rise inevitably involves questions about the methods she employed, the prices she was willing to pay, and the prices she demanded that others pay. History has painted her in many colors as a ruthless manipulator, as a brilliant political strategist, as a woman who transcended the limitations of her era through sheer force of will. Perhaps as with most complex historical figures, the truth encompasses elements of all these characterizations. What seems undeniable is that Wu Zhao understood, perhaps better than anyone of her generation, that power in the imperial court was not simply granted or inherited. It was seized, defended, and constantly renegotiated. The traditional structures that governed palace life were designed to prevent exactly the kind of rise she was attempting, which meant that conventional methods would ultimately prove insufficient. Her relationship with Empress Wang illustrates the tragic dimensions of her ascent. Empress Wang was by most accounts a woman of genuine virtue and considerable intelligence, someone who might have been an effective partner for Gaozong under different circumstances. But she had made the crucial mistake of underestimating Wu Zhao, treating her as a useful ally in palace politics rather than recognizing her as a formidable rival. The alliance between the Empress and Wu Zhao initially served both women's interests. Wang hoped that Wu Zhao's influence with the emperor might help reduce the power of Consort Zhao, another rival, while Wu Zhao saw an opportunity to gain Wang's support for her own advancement. But this cooperation contained the seeds of its own destruction. As Wu Zhao gradually came to understand that her ambitions could not be realized while someone else held the ultimate position of female authority in the palace, the events that led to Empress Wang's downfall remain disputed by historians. But what is clear is that Wu Zhao demonstrated a willingness to play palace politics at a level of sophistication and ruthlessness that few of her contemporaries could match. Whether through carefully orchestrated scandals, strategic alliances with key ministers, or simply through her superior understanding of Gaozong's psychological needs, she gradually undermined Wang's position while strengthening her own. In 6055, Empress Wang was deposed and Wu Zhao was elevated to take her place. The speed and completeness of this transformation shocked the court, but perhaps it should not have. Wu Zhao had spent years studying the mechanisms of power, learning how influence flowed through official and unofficial channels, understanding which pressures could be applied where and when. Yet becoming empress was only the beginning of Wu Zhao's truly unprecedented journey. Most empresses in Chinese history, even the most powerful ones, wielded influence primarily through their relationships with their husbands or sons. Wu Zhao seemed to understand from the beginning that such derivative power would ultimately prove limited. She was already beginning to envision something that had never existed in Chinese history: female authority that derived not from family relationships but from her own capability. The Tang Empire in the mid-7th century stretched from Korea to Central Asia, encompassing dozens of distinct cultures and languages, each with their own traditions and expectations regarding governance. The bureaucracy required to manage such an empire was vast and complex, filled with officials whose loyalty could never be taken for granted, and whose competence varied dramatically. Moreover, Gaozong was beginning to experience health problems that limited his ability to fulfill the demanding schedule of an emperor. Some historians suggest he may have suffered from stroke or other neurological conditions that affected both his stamina and his decision-making capacity. Whether by necessity or by design, Wu Zhao found herself assuming more and more of the actual responsibilities of rule. She approached these responsibilities with characteristic thoroughness and innovation. Rather than simply maintaining existing systems, she began implementing reforms that reflected her own understanding of effective governance. She expanded the imperial examination system, creating more opportunities for talented individuals from modest backgrounds to enter government service based on merit rather than family connection. She promoted religious tolerance, understanding that the empire's diversity required flexibility rather than uniformity in matters of faith. Perhaps most significantly, she demonstrated an ability to work with and through the established bureaucracy, while gradually reshaping it to reflect her own priorities. Rather than attempting to dismantle existing structures entirely, she learned to identify which officials could be trusted, which could be won over, and which represented insurmountable obstacles to effective governance. Her approach to foreign policy showed similar sophistication. The Tang Empire faced constant challenges along its borders, from Turkish tribes in the north to emerging powers in Central Asia. Wu Zhao proved remarkably skilled at combining military deterrence with diplomatic negotiation, understanding that sustainable security required both strength and flexibility. She oversaw military campaigns that extended Tang influence while also establishing trade relationships and cultural exchanges that created economic incentives for peace. But perhaps her most remarkable achievement during this period was her gradual transformation of court culture itself. Through her own example and through the officials she promoted, she began to create space for women to participate more fully in political and intellectual life. While she could not single-handedly overturn centuries of tradition, she demonstrated that female intelligence and female authority were not contradictions in terms. By the 670s, Wu Zhao was functioning as the de facto ruler of the Tang Empire, making the major decisions while Gaozong provided symbolic authority and ceremonial presence. Yet this arrangement, however effective it proved in practice, remained technically unofficial. Wu Zhao held the title of empress,
but her actual role had evolved far beyond what that title traditionally encompassed. The question that would define the next phase of her remarkable career was whether she would be content to wield power from behind a screen of male authority, or whether she would take the unprecedented step of claiming official recognition for the role she was already performing. When Emperor Gaozong died in 683, Wu Zhao faced a choice that no woman in Chinese history had ever confronted. She could follow tradition by stepping aside to allow her son, Li Jie, to ascend to the throne while she assumed the role of Empress Dowager, a position of considerable influence but one that remained fundamentally derivative. Or she could pursue a path that was not merely unconventional but literally inconceivable within the framework of Chinese political tradition. The immediate aftermath of Gaozong's death seemed to point toward conventional succession. Li Jie became Emperor Zhengzong, and Wu Zhao appeared to accept the role of Empress Dowager, providing guidance and support while her son navigated the early challenges of his reign. But those who knew her well might have recognized this apparent acceptance as strategic patience, rather than genuine resignation. Li Jie proved to be a weak ruler, easily manipulated by officials who saw an opportunity to advance their own interests while the young emperor struggled to establish his authority. Wu Zhao watched these developments with growing alarm, understanding that ineffective leadership at the top of the imperial hierarchy inevitably led to instability throughout the empire. Her years of experience in governance had given her a deep appreciation for the delicate balance required to maintain control over such a vast and diverse territory. In 684, Wu Zhao made a decision that sent shockwaves through the empire. She deposed her own son and replaced him with his younger brother Li Dan, who became Emperor Ruizong. But this second son proved no more capable than the first of providing the kind of strong leadership that Wu Zhao believed the empire required. The fiction of male rule was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain when the ostensible rulers lacked both the capability and the inclination to actually rule. For 6 years Wu Zhao continued to govern through this elaborate charade, making the real decisions while maintaining the pretense that ultimate authority rested with her son. But the strain of this arrangement was becoming unsustainable, and Wu Zhao was beginning to contemplate a solution that would have been unthinkable for anyone else, claiming the throne in her own name. The decision to declare herself emperor, not empress, but emperor, represented more than a personal ambition. It was a fundamental challenge to the cosmic order, as understood by traditional Chinese culture, where the emperor's authority derived not merely from political power but from his role as the Son of Heaven, the intermediary between the human world and the divine realm. For a woman to claim this position was to suggest that the fundamental principles governing the universe might be more flexible than anyone had previously imagined. Wu Zhao understood the magnitude of what she was contemplating. She had spent decades studying Chinese history and political philosophy, and she knew that there was no precedent for what she was considering. She would have to invent not merely new policies but an entirely new framework for understanding legitimate authority. The preparation for this unprecedented step was methodical and comprehensive. She began by commissioning scholars to search classical texts for any precedent that might support female rule. When such precedents proved scarce, she authorized the creation of new texts that argued for the legitimacy of her position. She cultivated relationships with Buddhist leaders who were willing to provide religious justification for her authority. Most importantly, she began to demonstrate through her governance that effective rule mattered more than adherence to traditional gender roles. In 690, at the age of 67, Wu Zhao took the final irrevocable step. She declared herself Emperor of China, taking the reign name Wu Zetian, meaning ruler of the sky. The announcement reverberated throughout the empire and beyond, challenging assumptions that had governed Chinese civilization for over 1,000 years. The immediate response was mixed but surprisingly muted. Some officials resigned in protest, unable to reconcile themselves to serving under a female emperor.
But many others, particularly those who had worked closely with Wu Zetian during her years as Empress and Empress Dowager, recognized that this formal change merely acknowledged a reality that had existed for decades. The empire had been functioning effectively under her leadership, and there was little appetite for the chaos that would inevitably accompany any attempt to forcibly remove her from power. Wu Zetian's reign as emperor lasted 15 years, from 690 to 705, and represented one of the most stable and prosperous periods in Chinese history. She continued the administrative and cultural reforms she had begun earlier, expanding educational opportunities, promoting trade and cultural exchange along the Silk Road, and maintaining the delicate balance of military strength and diplomatic flexibility that kept the empire's borders secure. Perhaps more significantly, she demonstrated that effective leadership was not inherently connected to gender. Her court functioned smoothly, her ministers remained loyal, and the empire continued to prosper. The dire predictions that had accompanied her ascension, that heaven would withdraw its mandate, that the cosmic order would collapse, that chaos would inevitably follow, proved unfounded. Yet Wu Zetian's reign was not without its dark aspects. Like many effective rulers throughout history, she demonstrated a willingness to use harsh methods when she believed they were necessary. Political opponents faced imprisonment, exile, or execution. The secret police that she employed to maintain order sometimes acted with excessive zeal. The same intelligence and ruthlessness that had enabled her remarkable rise also manifested in policies that could be cruel and unforgiving. These complexities reflect the fundamental challenge of evaluating any historical figure who wielded absolute power. Wu Zetian operated within a system that routinely employed violence and intimidation to maintain order, and her methods were not notably more harsh than those of her male counterpart. Yet because her very existence as emperor challenged established norms, her actions were scrutinized with an intensity that might not have been applied to a conventional ruler. What seems undeniable is that Wu Zetian possessed a remarkable ability to maintain stability and promote prosperity across an enormous and diverse empire. The Tang Dynasty during her reign reached levels of cultural and economic achievement that would be remembered as a golden age. Poetry flourished, trade expanded, and the capital at Chang'an became one of the world's great cosmopolitan centers. Behind the remarkable public achievements of Wu Zetian's reign lay a more intimate and often tragic story about the personal costs of transcending the boundaries that society had established for women. Her rise to power had required her to sacrifice or transform many of the relationships that typically defined female experience in her era. Her relationship with her children was inevitably complicated by the demands of her political position. She had deposed 2 of her sons, elevating political necessity over maternal sentiment in ways that must have created lasting psychological wounds for all involved. The sons she had displaced remained alive but marginalized, forced to watch their mother wield the authority they had been raised to expect as their birthright. Her relationships with other women at court were similarly complex. As the only woman to have achieved ultimate power, Wu Zetian existed in a category entirely by herself, unable to form the kinds of peer relationships that might have provided emotional support and companionship. Other women might admire her achievements or benefit from her policies, but they could not fully understand the isolation that accompanied her unprecedented position. Even her relationship with Gaozong, which had begun as a genuine love story and had evolved into an effective political partnership, had been fundamentally altered by the dynamics of power. By the end of his life, their marriage had become as much about governance as about personal intimacy, and Wu Zetian's grief at his death was complicated by the relief of no longer having to navigate the delicate balance between wifely duty and imperial authority. Perhaps most poignantly, Wu Zetian's transcendence of traditional female roles meant that she could never experience the kinds of relationships and activities that brought meaning to most women's lives in her era. She could not be simply a mother,
a wife or a friend without those relationships being filtered through the lens of her political position. Every personal interaction carried political implications. Every moment of vulnerability represented a potential threat to her authority. The loneliness of absolute power is a theme that runs through many historical accounts of great rulers. But Wu Zetian's isolation was particularly acute because she had achieved a position that literally no other woman had ever occupied. She had no role models to guide her, no precedents to follow, no community of peers who could understand the unique pressures she faced. Yet this isolation may also have been the source of some of her greatest strengths as a ruler. Freed from the conventional expectations that governed most people's lives, Wu Zetian was able to approach problems with a clarity and objectivity that might have been impossible for someone more embedded in traditional relationships and obligations. Her outsider status, while personally costly, may have enabled her to see solutions that more conventional rulers would have missed. By 705, Wu Zetian was 81 years old and beginning to show signs of the physical decline that even her remarkable constitution could not indefinitely resist. The question of succession, which she had deferred through decades of active rule, could no longer be avoided. Unlike traditional emperors, who could rely on established patterns of hereditary succession, Wu Zetian faced the unique challenge of transferring power when there was no precedent for how a female emperor should handle the transition. She had outlived most of her contemporaries, and the officials who now surrounded her were often men who had never known a world without her authority. For many of them, the idea of male imperial rule was more theoretical than practical. They had spent their entire careers serving under a woman and had seen how effectively such an arrangement could function. Yet Wu Zetian was also aware that her extraordinary reign represented a historical anomaly rather than a new tradition. She had achieved her position through a unique combination of intelligence, determination, and circumstance that was unlikely to be replicated. The question was not whether another woman might someday claim imperial authority, but rather how to ensure that her own achievements would not be undone by the inevitable return to conventional succession patterns. The final years of her reign were marked by increasing pressure from court officials who believed that the time had come for her to step aside in favor of a male successor. Some of this pressure came from genuine concern about the empire's stability, as foreign observers and domestic rivals began to wonder whether Wu Zetian's advancing age might create opportunities for challenges to Tang authority. But much of it reflected the deep discomfort that many officials continued to feel about serving under a female emperor, despite years of evidence that such service was not inherently problematic. Wu Zetian's response to these pressures revealed both her political wisdom and her understanding of the broader historical forces at work. Rather than clinging to power indefinitely, she began to orchestrate a carefully managed transition that would preserve her achievements while acknowledging the reality that her unique reign could not be extended indefinitely. In 705, she formally abdicated in favor of her son Lai Shun, who resumed the throne as Emperor Zhengzong. The transition was remarkably smooth, suggesting that Wu Zetian had retained both the political skill and the institutional support necessary to control even this final act of her remarkable career. Wu Zetian died later that same year, on December 16, 705, at the age of 8. Her death marked the end not only of an extraordinary individual life but of a unique experiment in female authority that would not be attempted again in Chinese history. In the centuries following Wu Zetian's death, Chinese historians and political philosophers struggled to understand the meaning of her reign and its place in the broader sweep of their civilization. Some portrayed her as an aberration, a temporary disruption of natural order that had ultimately been corrected by the restoration of male rule. Others recognized her as a capable administrator whose policies had contributed to the Tang dynasty's golden age, regardless of the unprecedented nature of her authority. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Wu Zetian's legacy was not what she accomplished during her lifetime, but rather what she demonstrated about the nature of leadership itself. By proving that effective governance was not inherently connected to gender, she opened up possibilities that had previously been literally unthinkable. While no other woman in Chinese history would claim the title of emperor, Wu Zetian's example provided evidence that such achievement was possible in principle, even if the specific circumstances that enabled it were unlikely to recur. Her story also illuminated the complex relationship between individual ambition and social progress. Wu Zetian's rise was motivated primarily by her own desire for power and authority, rather than by any explicit agenda to advance women's rights more broadly. Yet her success inevitably created space for other women to participate more fully in political and intellectual life, even if they never approached the level of authority she had achieved. The administrative and cultural policies she implemented during her reign outlasted her personal rule and contributed to the Tang dynasty's reputation as a high point of Chinese civilization. Her expansion of the examination system, her promotion of religious tolerance, her careful balance of military strength and diplomatic flexibility. All of these approaches influenced Chinese governance for generations after her death. Perhaps most importantly, Wu Zetian's story serves as a reminder that the boundaries societies establish around what is possible are often more flexible than they appear. Her achievement required exceptional intelligence, determination, and political skill, but it also required a willingness to imagine alternatives to the established order and the courage to pursue those alternatives despite enormous risk. As we sit here together in the quiet of this evening, dear listener, contemplating Wu Zetian's extraordinary journey from palace concubine to emperor of China, I find myself wondering what she might think of our own world, where women lead governments and corporations, where the idea of female authority has become unremarkable in many contexts, though certainly not in all. Would she recognize the seeds of our contemporary possibilities in her own unprecedented achievement? Would she be surprised by how long it took for other societies to follow paths that she pioneered 13 centuries ago? Or would she perhaps be most struck by how many of the fundamental challenges of leadership, the balance between authority and compassion, the tension between stability and innovation, the loneliness of ultimate responsibility, remain unchanged across the century? Her story reminds us that progress is rarely linear, that breakthroughs can be followed by long periods of retrenchment, and that the courage of individuals to transcend established limitations often precedes broader social change by generations or even centuries. Wu Zetian's reign ended with her death, and it would be over a millennium before women would again hold comparable political authority in China. Yet her example persisted, embedded in the historical record as proof that what had once seemed impossible was in fact merely unprecedented. There's something deeply moving about imagining her in those final years of her reign, an elderly woman who had achieved something that no one before her had even attempted. The palaces that had once seemed so forbidding when she first entered them as a 13-year-old concubine had become the stage for her unprecedented performance of power. The protocols and traditions that had once constrained her had been bent to accommodate her unique authority. Yet I suspect that in quiet moments she may have wondered what other paths her life might have taken in a world that had offered different possibilities for women from the beginning. The intelligence and determination that carried her to the Dragon Throne might have found expression in poetry or scholarship, in commerce or exploration.